Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the History Blokes, the podcast where we talk about strange stories, interesting facts and fascinating people from Australia's past we think you ought to know. I'm Chris McComb.
Conan Elphick here.
And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And Conan, what are we going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about two things. First up, I want to talk about the Citizenship Act. And this is obviously fundamental to Australian identity. It is legislation, but it is interesting, I can assure you. I don't know if I'm protesting too much already. After the intermission, we'll be talking about the Flag Act. Does that sound interesting to you?
I have to admit, no.
But fair enough, Chris, and yet it's going to blow your mind.
Okay, I'm really looking forward to this.
But before we do that, I'm going to make good on a promise that I have loosely made a couple of times over the last year since we started doing this. We're going to talk about New Zealand in the form of this quiz. So brace yourself. Are you braced?
I am very braced. Always with a little bit of trepidation as we go into the quiz.
But I mean, I guess in some ways, don't feel too bad about this, because I suspect that most Australians would really struggle with these questions, which I guess is the point. So anyway, question one. Within a century or so, when did the Maori arrive in what we now call New Zealand?
It was around 1000 AD to 1200 in that range.
Yeah, I get that too.
In that range. I knew it was about 800 to 1000 years ago.
Yeah, look, I mean, the thing I found with doing the research for this quiz is that there's not much that's decisive. Okay, the 13th century is what comes up frequently, but I have come across sources that say it was quite a bit earlier than that. Who really knows? Do you happen to know whether they were the first humans to settle New Zealand?
No, I don't. Look, I presume yes.
Again, I did research. I couldn't get a clear answer. My sense is that the Maori were the first to settle what was the last significant landmass in the world to be settled by humans. Yeah. Question two. Who was the first European to set eyes on New Zealand?
I'm going to say maybe Tasman.
Yes. Any idea when? Well, obviously he was Dutch. Abel Tasman. Yeah. When? Decade or so?
Mid-1700s.
So no, 1642.
Okay, so I missed by 100 years, basically.
Yes. I mean, and that's the point where the Dutch were doing all this.
Yeah,
the Dutch East Indies Company, and we've discussed this in Batavia. And Cook found it in 1769, and he was the first to map it, of course, on his first expedition. That was just before he obviously arrived on the east coast of Australia. Question three, when did Europeans colonise New Zealand?
Well, I'm going to say around the mid-1800s, because it wasn't long after that they established the Treaty of Waitangi. So, complete guess.
A little bit early, Lord. Yeah. I mean, again, difficulty for us as Australians is we're used to there being a specific date when, Australia was colonised. It was much more of a gradual process. So there wasn't a first fleet. There wasn't a particular, as far as I know, a particular point where it was declared that, Europeans are here. It does seem to happen quite gradually from the 1810s, 1820s onwards. The Treaty of Waitangi was in 1840.
It was earlier than I thought. For some reason, I thought it was the 1860s.
And up until then, or around that time, then New Zealand was technically part of New South Wales administratively. Question four, when did New Zealand become independent?
That's a good question, actually. Independent, I'm going to say probably around the same time as Australia's federation. Given they were tempting New Zealand to be part of that federated structure, I'm going to presume it was around the same time.
That's a reasonable assumption, yeah. So remember that federation's not independence. It wasn't anything like 1776 before America, where it was a declaration of independence. We just sort of federated, the 6 colonies federated into an agglomeration of self-governing, quasi-independent states under, obviously, the auspices of the federal government. There was an element of a desire in Australia to be seen as distinct from Britain, but not in any way independent from it. So that distinction is important. New Zealand, if anything, they were even more sort of Anglophile. So in 1906...
It makes sense given they were the free settlers, so to speak, as well.
Yeah, so I think in 1907, independence is even less relevant to what they did in 1907. They changed their name from a colony to a dominion, which is a word that still sort of crops up in contemporary New Zealand. And all that meant was that it was simply a name change. It had no other significance. They were not in any way legally distinct from Britain. any more than they had been before they changed the name from
Really?
colony to dominion.
I did not know that at all.
Yeah,
My
I didn't know
goodness.
that either. Oh, and very gradually, since then, a lot like Australia, it's just sort of, in a very piecemeal fashion, extracted itself from Britain. So they no longer refer to themselves as a dominion, they now call themselves a realm, in the same way that we call ourselves a commonwealth. I mean, they are now as an independent of Britain as we are.
Of course.
But it was quite gradual, and there was never anything as marked a separation as federation was for us. But that's because I guess they weren't made up of separate colonies. There was a single colony, so there was no need to federate.
Oh, that's really interesting, Conan.
Final question: what percentage of the population of New Zealand is Maori? Compared to Australia, is Aboriginal?
Yeah, it's about 4% in Australia are Aboriginal, I believe. Maori, that's a good question. I'm going to say it's a high proportion, double, 8%.
It's 17%.
Wow.
Yeah, Maori is an official language of New Zealand. So English, Maori, and the sign language. Yes, and I think for Aboriginal people it's about 3% when I googled it this morning.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, this isn't really an attempt to make fun of New Zealanders and their relationship with livestock. Famously, there were more sheep in New Zealand than humans. It might even be true of Australia.
I think it was true of Australia for a long time. Yeah.
Do you know how many times?
I'm going to say
sheep?
10 times.
Yes.
Yeah, like 5 million, 50 million sheep.
Yes.
Yep.
10 times.
Well, there you
10
go.
times the number of sheep. There you are. Let's talk about the Citizenship Act. It's called the Nationality and Citizenship Act of 1948. And it marked the first time the term Australian citizen had been used in any legislation, including the Constitution, up until that point. While the Act had symbolic importance, it was driven more by pragmatism than a desire to enshrine a distinct national identity. So the Act, and it's been much amended since, it's still in force. It provides the legislative framework for how a person becomes an Australian citizen. The whole issue related to immigration. Australia's first immigration minister, do you know who that was?
No idea.
It might ring a bell. Arthur Coolwell.
Does sound familiar.
Yeah. This is what he said in 1948. The Act will symbolise not only our own pride in Australia, but also our willingness to offer a share in our future to the new Australians we are seeking in such vast numbers. They will no longer need to strive towards an intangible goal, but can aspire to the honour of Australian citizenship. We shall try to teach the children that they are fortunate to be British, and even more fortunate to be Australian.
I wonder where they were seeking those new Australians from.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This was the time. Yeah,
it was the whole White Australia policy. Was that around that time?
The White Australia policy was introduced in 1901. That was part of the driving force behind Federation. We've got to stop the yellow peril, as they called it, the Chinese and Japanese swooping in from the north. And you might remember seeing at school in history classes those terrible racist cartoons that the Bulletin published around then. The Bulletin was really racist, of very caricatured Chinese people coming in, taking over Australia. So one of the reasons they federated was that they could introduce that legislation, which basically meant only white people, and that lasted for many, many decades. But it was in force around this time.
Yeah, sure.
However, the war had demonstrated that we needed more people. It was a big country. There were only a few million of us. We needed immigrants. The problem was we had the White Australia policy, and Australians were super racist. So what do you do? Have you heard the term beautiful bolts? So
no, that's a new one for me.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So they thought. So obviously they were getting the £10 POM scheme. They were getting a lot of Brits who were obviously seeking a better life for themselves. In the 40s, in the post-war Britain, you can imagine how many people were quite desperate to get out of there. But even so, there weren't enough Brits and Irish coming over, so they had to expand immigration. But because of the racism, Coolwell realised he had to get people who were as white as they could possibly be. So the Baltic states were targeted. Immigration officials over there would invite people to emigrate to Australia, and they would select those who were the best looking.
No, come on,
yes.
No bollocks.
Yes,
that's
true.
rubbish.
It's true.
And
there was a massive.
Cannot
PR.
believe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just such a subjective.
Well,
it's so silly.
It is.
It's just so incredibly
it's
silly.
Insane. But you've got to remember how insular we were, how parochial. So you've got to gently phase in immigration. So you start with attractive looking Balts who are completely Northern European whites, And then they introduced the Greeks and Italians after that. Anyway, so prior to 1949, there was no such thing as an Australian citizen. So we'd been federated for nearly half a century, and everyone was British.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah, not many people do, which is why we're talking about this.
My goodness. Okay. No, that's... Yeah,
it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. That's what I mean. Federation was not about independence. Before that, anyone born or naturalised just means being made a citizen, in Australia was a British subject. If travelling overseas, people were issued with British passports. But they were, what they would say is British passport, and then in smaller writing underneath, Australia. Unlike the US Constitution, the Australian Constitution has little to say on the subject of citizenship beyond stating that to stand for Parliament, you cannot have dual nationality. And we know that, of course, from the various debacles and scandals over recent years of sitting MPs being dual national. And that's because at the time of Federation, and until at least the Second World War, the majority of Australians identified themselves as British. And I guess they would have just seen themselves as a particular kind of British. However, 1946, the Canadian government was the first within the Commonwealth to implement its own Citizenship Act. And this undermined the uniformity of British subject status across the Commonwealth and led to the convening of the British Commonwealth Conference on Nationality and Citizenship in London in 1947. And it was at that conference that it was agreed by all the self-governing nations of the Commonwealth so that each nation would be free to define its own citizenship. So this led to the passing of the British Nationality Act in Britain in 1948, similar legislation in New Zealand the same year, and in Australia in the same year. South Africa followed in 1949. So in Australia, the Nationality and Citizenship Act was introduced to the House of Reps by Calwell, and he was at pains to point out that Australians would remain British subjects while also becoming Australian citizens. Because, even then, they wanted to remain British.
Have no fear. We will always be British.
Yes. Yeah. The principle underpinning the Act was assimilation, that dreaded word, which we used when we were talking about David Unipon in relation to Aboriginal people. So, it's fine to be Aboriginal as long as you're assimilating as much as you possibly can, and it's fine to be an immigrant as long as you're doing the same thing. I mean, it's not ideal you're an immigrant or you're Aboriginal, but if you're assimilating...
Be whoever you want, just be like us.
Yes, that's right. So immigrants were expected to assimilate into Australian society as much as possible, and Australian citizenship was offered as an incentive to do that. The coalition were outraged by the legislation, and they saw it as, quote, a sinister plot to liquidate the empire.
Sinister plot. Oh, I love it. That's a classic for sure.
So the Act was passed in 1948, came into effect on Australia Day 1949. So this is what it did. It created an Australian citizenship and the conditions by which it could be acquired. The major provisions were that all Australian-born and other British subjects resident in Australia for the 5 years prior to Australia Day 1949 were automatically Australian citizens. Anyone born in Australia on or after that date was automatically an Australian citizen. Anyone defined as an Australian citizen also became or retained the status of British subject. However, under the Act, British subjects who wished to become Australian citizens could do so quickly and easily, whereas aliens, quote unquote...
Aliens.
Yeah.
I've seen that movie.
Yes.
Scared the pants off me.
Yeah. So, sadly, not actual aliens, but foreigners resident in Australia who were not British subjects, they found it a lot harder. And I assume that would have applied to white people who just happened not to be British.
Absolutely.
The French, whatever.
Yeah.
So the Department of Immigration saw the take-up of Australian citizenship and the success of its migration policies as being closely interlinked. And so it monitored the naturalisation rates. But relatively few migrants applied for citizenship, partly because it conferred too few benefits. Like it didn't increase your chances of getting work or government benefits.
There's no reason to get it, basically.
No, not really. And partly also because it was quite a long, complicated process if you weren't a British subject. So from 1950, the government organised, well, I had never heard of these really, Australian citizenship conventions and what was called the Good Neighbour movement to help promote citizenship and encourage new citizens to assimilate by providing formal language and culture classes, written resources and advice bureaus. Culture classes. I would love to have seen 1950s Australian culture class. What would they have discussed?
Can Can you imagine these? I just think it's brilliant. I mean, outside of Bradman's batting average, I've got no idea what they might contain.
Yeah. First Nations people gained almost nothing from the legislation.
That surprises me.
Who would have thought? They were not specifically excluded from the legislation, and so were technically Australian citizens. However, they were still unable to vote, one of the key privileges of citizenship. Right? Chris, we've discussed this before, but I'm going to test you on it again. When did Indigenous people get the right to vote?
No, that's a good question. Now, I was literally going to go to the referenda to have them on the census, right? I was going to go to that. The referendum, 2 years after that.
Oh, well, yeah.
I was close.
You're close in the sense that it's not that referendum, the famous 1967 referendum.
Yeah, that's right.
It was 5 years before that, 1962, under Menzies, of all people, but it wasn't compulsory for them to do so, as it was for everyone else. Back to the Citizenship Act. Since it was passed, the Act has been amended more than 30 times. From 1973, federal governments have gradually removed the favoured status accorded to British subjects. In 1984, importantly, the law was altered so that Australian citizens would no longer be considered British subjects. And British citizens arriving in Australia would no longer be able to vote in elections until they had become Australian citizens. I didn't know they could do that.
I didn't know that either. My goodness.
Chris, so I'm going to talk about the Flags Act after the intermission, but you're going to talk about the Kiwi flag.
I am indeed. All right, Conan. I'm going to start with, dare I say, a quiz. Now
Fair enough. Can I just say, Chris, fair enough.
It's going to be a very short quiz, I promise you that. And then, of course, I'm going to be talking about recent attempts to change the New Zealand national flag. So, first of all, first question, which national flag is the only one that isn't rectangular?
The Danish. Swiss. Danish.
Wrong. The Nepalese flag is the only one that isn't rectangular. It's like a series of triangles, effectively, which is interesting. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Really?
It's interesting.
Series of triangles.
Yes, it's two triangles, one above the other, with lots of interesting things on them.
How charming. That's charming.
It is charming. I think it's kind of cool.
Fact.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. Which is the only flag in the world that features an AK-47? I will give you half points if you at least get the right part of the world.
Okay. I would say North Africa. No?
I'll give you half point for Africa alone. I mean, let's face it. Yeah.
So I'd say Congo.
Mozambique has interestingly, the two foundations of their country are on the flag. One being a book, and another being an AK-47, which is fascinating. It's fascinating.
That's great.
Which flags in the world have a dragon on them?
The Welsh flag.
The Welsh flag, yes. Okay, half a point.
Maybe I don't know, Chris. I don't know.
The Bhutanese flag is the other one, and Wales, of course, which you picked up.
Yeah.
So half a point.
Oh.
Not too bad. Look, I'm just going to make a recommendation to the listeners to go and have a look at the Sicilian flag. It looks a little bit like the Isle of Man flag. Kind of a strange head appearing out of three legs on the flag. It's just fascinating. A triskelion.
I don't mean to offend any Sicilian or Manx people listening to this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that two islands have three-legged flags, because I associate islands with inbreeding. I haven't been to Sicily. I have been to the Isle of Man, Chris, and inbreeding is very much in evidence.
We don't have many listeners at the Isle of Man, do we?
No, we are. I assume we don't. Famously the cats there, the Manx cat is tailless.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And if there was ever an example of,
and that is due to inbreeding. It is not deliberate. They have not deliberately bred them without tails. They're just
lost its tail when
due to inbreeding.
Brother and sister get together.
Yeah, and we saw people outside of the main town of Douglas. Not many people know the capital of the Isle of Man, Chris. I do. And now the listeners do as well. You go out into the countryside and you go, oh, that person doesn't look right.
So, that brings us on to the story of changing the New Zealand national flag. And look, we know that the national flag's been a little bit contentious here in Australia for a long time as well. And it's similarly in New Zealand. It goes all the way going right back to World War II, been on again, off again debate around changing the New Zealand flag.
And I guess the issue is the presence of the Union Jack in it.
The presence of the Union Jack and the need to really assert the independence of New Zealand from Britain. On again, off again, different ministers have raised it, let's make it more representative. There's been suggestions that it should include the Maori emblem on the flag and, all sorts of things to make it truly a New Zealand flag. And we completely understand that. Over time, there's been different design contests, but nothing's really sort of borne fruit. Nothing's become a decision point, I suppose, until the last 13 or 14 years, to be honest with you, where we got to a decision point and a series of referenda were held where New Zealand's got to choose a new flag.
So what kicked that off?
Well, what kicked it off was Prime Minister John Key. He floated the idea of a referendum ahead of the 2014 election.
Is he the one that likes putting the ponytails of women and girls?
That's a very good question.
I think
it could be.
I think he was.
He was conservative.
Yeah.
10 years ago.
Yeah, there's it's worth YouTubing.
Oh, no, really? Is that a real thing? I remember reading that somewhere.
He was just this video footage of like a girl talking to the camera next to him. It's at a press conference. And you can see his hand just sort of wander into frame. And he obviously just can't resist a ponytail. And he just gives it a bit of a quick yank. It's very weird. It's just, what are you doing, you insane man?
I think we're all going to be Googling that after this podcast. So anyway, it was a bit of an election ploy, right? So Prime Minister Key said, look, if we get elected for a third term in 2014... one of our promises is to hold a referendum on changing the flag, okay? I'd like to think there wasn't actually a lot of political capital in it. New Zealanders, similar to Australians, kind of don't care about a lot of this stuff. They think, we'd rather you focus on, for example, the housing crisis and the kind of things that are a bit more material versus things that, might...
Symbolic.
Yeah, symbolic, exactly. Anyway, they were voted back in. And therefore, they decided to proceed with the referendum. And what was interesting is, it almost goes back to some of the earlier comments. What do you think are the key reasons, the critical reasons why they needed to change their flag? Go on, hit us with it.
Is the real reason surprising?
The real reason is trivial.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh. Is it related to rugby?
No.
Because, not trivial to New Zealanders, very trivial to me. Separating making the flag different from that of Australia, that's not it, or Britain.
Oh, look, I actually think you're extremely close. In fact, probably on point here. Look, there's a range of reasons why. One of them, of course, is to remove the Union Jack. The Union Jack is a throwback to, obviously, its colonial origins, and of course doesn't recognise the Maoris, the Maori history, doesn't recognise everyone else from everywhere else, of course, that forms part of New Zealand society. But the main reason put forward by the PM at the time was the sheer confusion between the Australian and New Zealand flags.
Right.
It happened time and time again where Prime Minister Key would turn up at an international event and be placed in front of an Australian flag, which is absolutely hilarious. But it didn't just happen to the New Zealand folk; it's happened to Australians as well. Yeah. Maybe going back, I think it probably irks them a little bit more than it irks us, I suspect. I think it was really grinding John Key's gears. So anyway, that was the primary reason. You can see why New Zealanders were probably a little bit apathetic to the whole business.
It's not their problem.
So they were going to kick this thing off. They initially went out and sought public submissions on what the new flag might look like. And they received some 10,500 different designs as part of that process. And they kind of whittled that down to a list of 40 flags. And I tell you, in my mind, this was the Bodie McBoat-faced moment for the New Zealanders.
Sure.
So
there are quite a few silly flags.
Yeah, that's right.
So what were some of the corkers?
So some of the corkers. I just love this stuff. And this is where they should have gone. So, first of all, indeed, I'm going to flick through some of these pictures. for Conan's benefit, and I do recommend you have a look at this. The first one was the one where there's this silver fern. I should say silver fern's featured very, very strongly.
Is it the national plant or flower of New Zealand? Or?
It is, but also it's the Rugby Union All Blacks flag, the silver ferns. That's basically where it's at. I know. I think rugby has really, I mean, it's a very strong part of the New Zealand psyche. So one of my favourites, and please Google this, guys, is one called Fire the Laser, which is essentially a kiwi firing a laser bolt from its eyes and sort of, I don't know, just destroying something.
What it's zapping.
And the description was the laser beam projects a powerful image of New Zealand. And I believe my design is so powerful, it does not need to be discussed any further. I'll move on to the next one, which is effectively a Mr. Potato Head that was submitted to be part of their national flag. And it was literally called Potato Man. It stands for New Zealand's fish and chips. Really important there.
Let's see the fish.
There's another one called Te Pepe, which is effectively a very, very sad-looking kind of Kiwi Muppet type character with a large blue body. And the New Zealand flag just printed on that. The existing New Zealand flag printed onto the body, which I think is fascinating. What happened, right?
Yeah.
They got this committee together. Don't do anything by committee, folks. They end up choosing 40 flags.
Yeah.
Call them more serious designs. Silver ferns, Southern Crosses, blah, 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 all very serious, all very similar.
There's not a laser bolt inside.
There's not a laser bolt inside. And a lot of it looking a little bit like their rugby flag. But anyway, so that's kind of where they landed on their shortlist. And then this committee sought to whittle it down to 5 flags. And I'll show you that ballot paper there. So what we're left with, of course, is 5 flags, which were going out as part of 2 referenda. The first referendum was to narrow down the preferred alternative flag. The second referendum, it was to pitch that alternative flag against the existing flag. And they were done, and this is what we should do in referenda to save ourselves $500 million. It was a postal vote.
Yeah.
I think that makes a heck of a lot of sense. It cost tens of millions of dollars and not $500 million to run these sorts of things, in my mind.
And they're all, obviously the listener can't. They're all attractive.
They are attractive.
I won't bother describing them, but yes, there's a strong fern element. 2 of them, they've got the original Southern Cross thing. Great.
First referendum was held in November, December 2015. And the flag that won, I should say, is a silver fern flag on a blue background with the existing Southern Cross and a black triangle wedge in the top left-hand corner. So you can see that there.
Yeah. Look, I thought at the time that's a really good-looking flag. It's dignified. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's great. They've retained the Southern Cross, so there's a bit of heritage there from the original. It's just gorgeous.
Yeah. It's an attractive flag, I agree.
You'd have to be insane not to vote in support of replacing the crappy one they have now with that.
I think it might have come down to a lack of interest, which is interesting. I mean,
they voted. Those who voted were interested enough to vote.
So voting, of course, isn't compulsory in New Zealand. And who knows, maybe if they'd all voted, things might have gone differently. And unfortunately, we've jumped ahead to the results of the second referendum very clearly, which you'd all be aware of. So they pitched that flag against the existing flag. About 3 months later, March 2016, the alternative flag got the punt, and the existing flag remains. So we ended up with about 43% voting for the silver fern flag, I'll describe it as that, the attractive flag, and 56% voted for the existing New Zealand flag. I think they had about 2/3 turnout. Not a massive turnout.
Do you happen to know whether there was a strong no campaign?
There was a bit of a no campaign, the Historical Society, and look, to be honest with you, it was a politically motivated no campaign. They're going, you're just wasting our time while we've got bigger issues to fry. And most people describe the whole process as a complete and utter waste of money.
Do you know how much it cost?
$27 million.
If you're talking about government waste, 27 is
it's
nothing.
Mickey Mouse stuff, 100%. I think probably an efficient way to get to a no. But it means they're not going to go back to it for a long time. It does speak to the importance of timing around referendum. You don't do it when people are worried about other things, because they will think you're just wasting their time.
Presumably, even New Zealand will become a republic, at which point they've got a flag ready to go.
Yeah, that's right.
Unless they ridiculously start the whole thing again in terms of design.
Absolutely.
That would be my advice. I hope they're listening. I have to say, when the outcome became known to me, I was most disappointed in New Zealand. I just thought, come on, guys. You've gone to all the trouble and expense of the referendum. You might as well just change it. Just whatever you think of John Key and his ponytail pudding, just get a proper flag instead of one that looks like a rip-off of Australia. Well, look, Chris, thank you for that. I will be talking about flags too, obviously the Australian flag and in particular the Flag Act. Any idea when the Australian national flag that we have now was designed?
I'm going to say not long after Federation, surely. I mean, the first 10 years after Federation.
Yes, very good.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a competition, and if you think 10,500 New Zealanders submitting designs was a large number, it was nothing compared to the Australian flag. So anyway, 33,000 people submitted designs in the wake of Federation. And of course, the one that ultimately won was the one we have now. This is what the Bulletin said in September 1901 of that design. And it involves a French word I've never heard before. It describes it as a style de rechauffe of the British flag. Let's just call that rehash of the British flag, with no artistic virtue, no national significance. Minds move slowly, and Australia is still Britain's little boy. What more natural than that he should accept his father's cut-down garments? Lacking the power to protest, and only dimly realising his will, that bastard flag is a true symbol of the bastard state of Australian opinion.
Oh, that's genius. I love it.
Strong views. And look, they're right.
You know what? I can't disagree with it.
Let's talk a bit about flags. The Danes, they traditionally believe that their flag was given to one of the ancient kings directly by God. And I've seen a painting in Denmark of that king, I think in a battlefield, having achieved victory. And he's on a small hill or something, and God is handing him the Danish flag, straight to him. Yeah,
wow, there you go.
The Danes are really into waving their flags around. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Flags, as we know them today, have been around since the early 17th century, when they began to appear on battlefields and were flown from ships. A variety emerged in Australia throughout the 19th century as potential national flags. All of them featured the Southern Cross, the constellation only visible from the Southern Hemisphere, and all but the Eureka flag included the Union Jack in the top left quarter. And there's for people who are into flags, and there's probably a name to describe people who are into flags, like philatelists or numismatists and stamps and coins. Chris, you're Googling it, thank you.
A person who studies flags is a vexillologist.
Wow.
One who designs flags is a vexillographer. And one who is a hobbyist or general admirer of flags, by the way, I think that's the funniest one, is a vexillophile. Incredible. I've learned something today.
Yeah. Is that the most interesting thing you've learned today?
I think it is.
Yeah,
I think it is, for sure.
Makes me feel like I've wasted a lot of... As vexophiles, or whatever they're called...
Vexillophiles.
Vexillophiles will know, different parts of the flag have different names. So where the Union Jack sits is known as the canton.
I didn't know that. By the way, I had no idea. No, it's interesting.
Now, of course, the individual colonies had flags. But in the lead up to Federation, the Melbourne Herald newspaper and a journal called the Review of Reviews for Australasia, that's quite a mouthful, held competitions to design a flag for the new quasi-independent nation. However, these competitions were then folded into one run by the federal government after Federation, and that offered more prize money. The competition stipulated it wanted designs for two flags, one for official use and one to be used by merchant ships registered in Australia. So as I said, 33,000 submissions poured in. The results were announced on 3rd of September 1901 at the Melbourne Exhibition Building, where many of these submissions were on display. There was £200 prize money.
That's huge money for the time.
That's,
absolutely.
It's worth submitting stuff.
I'd love to see if there's some Bodie McBoatface. Like, did people back in that time have a similar sense of humour?
It's a good question.
I'd love to know.
Yeah. You could have, there must have been some silly submissions out of that 33,000, intended or otherwise, I would say. So in the end, 5 people basically came up with the same design. And so the 200 quid was divided between them. And it was called at the time the Blue Ensign. And the one that was used for merchant ships, which was really just the same, but on a red background, was called the Red Ensign. And most of the other submissions also had a Union Jack in the canton, right? So, of course, what we see on the flag then, so obviously we've got the Southern Cross, and then you've got that star underneath the Union Jack, underneath the canton, which the New Zealanders don't have.
Mm-hmm.
How many points on that star, Chris?
6.
No.
7?
Correct.
7. Hang on. I thought it was for each of the states, and one for the Commonwealth. Is that right?
No, one for the territories. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, but that was a later addition.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah, initially, yes, one for each of the states. So a 6-pointed star. Yeah, so the flags accurately reflected an Australia that saw itself as simultaneously distinct from Britain, but very much affiliated with it. So, unlike today, dare I say, it was a flag for its time. Interestingly, the blue ensign was rarely used, even though it won the competition. It was agreed that it was the national flag. This was due in part to the fact that Australians still felt a strong allegiance to Britain, so much so that they couldn't bear to use a flag with a Union Jack in it. They had to use the Union Jack itself. But also because the federal government didn't advocate its use by the public. So the blue ensign was designated for use only by the government, but even the government preferred to use the Union Jack. So ridiculous.
It's a kind of, that was just worried about offending people or something. You know what I mean? Like just a little bit worried about pushback.
Maybe, it could have been that. But I think the government, as the rest of the population, just felt British. Certainly up until the Second World War. Although in the First World War, the blue ensign did enjoy some popularity, appearing in pro-war propaganda posters and occasionally taken into battle. But between the wars, the use of the Union Jack, the blue ensign and the red ensign largely came down to personal preference.
Wow.
Now, the Flags Act, the Menzies government introduced this legislation to encourage people to use the blue ensign instead of the Union Jack and the red ensign, and that the latter should only be used on merchant ships, because people were using the red ensign sort of interchangeably with the blue ensign and the Union Jack.
Now, the red ensign, interestingly, was hijacked by the conspiracy folk just a few years ago, the anti-vax groups here during the COVID pandemic. We had rallies here in Canberra, if I recall, where people were running around and trying to storm, driving around Parliament House and doing all the sort of things that they do and beeping and carrying on with the red ensign flag, I think upside down, hanging out the window of their car and things like that, as a sign of this protest movement. Interesting.
I didn't know that, yeah. The bill was passed in December 1953 and given royal assent on Valentine's Day the following year by the Queen, who happened to be visiting at the time. The flag has been barely changed since the 1901 competition, though in 1908, when Australia acquired Papua as an external territory, that was when the 7th point was added to the Federation Star. It was introduced because of Papua, but it was intended to represent all subsequent territories.
Yeah, but the trigger for the 7th point was Papua.
Yes.
Which I think is fascinating. I think that's a very interesting
Yeah, and it
piece of
represents
history there.
internal and external territories.
Yeah.
So, what are Australia's 3 internal territories, Chris?
Oh, it's the ACT, the Northern Territory, and Jarvis.
Very good.
Jarvis Bay.
Some people think Jarvis Bay is an extension of the ACT, but it's actually a separate territory. There you go. It's a sort of has laws governing it, or those of the ACT, but it's not actually governed by the ACT. It's a separate territory. They are.
It's really interesting. I mean, it seems like a hell of a bureaucracy for a very, 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 very tiny piece of the landscape.
Yes, but a very pretty part. And I think the idea of creating it was so that the capital would have access to the sea. Though what I would prefer is if
originally
the highway joining it to Canberra was also a territory, so that when you're driving from Canberra to Jarvis Bay, you never leave the territory you're in. I like that idea.
I really like that. And how many territories do we have, Conan?
External territories. I've got a list here. I was going to. Are you?
About
testing
26, I think.
26.
I think in that range.
Can you rattle off a few from?
Christmas Island,
Yes.
Obviously, Cocos,
Yep.
Bounty people on Norfolk Island, Antarctic Territory.
Yeah. And now we get to the obscure ones.
Yeah, I can't remember any of the others,
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you.
So Ashmore and Cartier Islands.
Wow.
They're sort of atoll reefy jobs out in the Indian Ocean somewhere. The Heard Island and McDonald Islands. That sounds a bit Southern Ocean to me. And Coral Sea Islands.
Yeah.
I didn't even know of those. There you go. Now, with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, in 1995, both of those flags were proclaimed official flags under the amended Flags Act. And the Aboriginal flag, any idea when that was designed? Give me a decade.
I would have said the early 1990s.
A bit earlier, 71.
Oh, 71. Oh, gosh, I missed that completely.
No, fair enough.
And only recently the copyright for that flag has been relinquished.
Yeah, that's true.
Basically because the federal government settled with the designer of the flag.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Who was Harold Thomas. And it was first flown in Adelaide on National Aborigines Day in July 1971. And it became the official flag for the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. And the Torres Strait Islander flag was designed by the late Bernard Namok. It was adopted.
Now, that's a great flag.
Yeah.
I really like the Torres Strait Islander flag.
Yeah.
I think that looks, it's just cool. You know?
Yeah. It was adopted in 1992, and that was the result of a design competition. Now, Chris, if you were to change our flag, presumably we will, even when we become a republic, what would you change it to?
I'd like to have our Bodie McBoatface moment and maybe a large echidna with laser eyes. Let's have an echidna maybe in the canton. Thank you. The echidna in the canton and a Southern Cross. What do you think about that?
I'm very strongly anti-echidna. I don't like monotremes.
Yeah.
I like my mammals with placentas or with pouches. I don't like them laying eggs. It's wrong.
An affront to God. But the point is, I think whatever the flag is, it needs to have a strong signal to our Indigenous heritage. I think that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah. The national flower, I'd like to change that from the golden wattle, which is ridiculous. I can't take that seriously as a flower, to the triffid.
The triffid. Is that Australian?
No, it's not Australian, but the triffid is not the national plant of any country, and it's never going to be. So it's time someone took action. And also, it's a plant that does not muck around.
Don't mess with the plant.
Yeah. So I think it's sending a strong message to anyone who would be thinking of invading Australia or crossing us in any way. Chris, that's the end of flags. That's the end of citizenship. Chris, we probably tell the disappointed listener that this is our penultimate episode. The final episode next time will be on the smallpox epidemic of 1789. Until then, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Conan. I've learned a lot again today. I think it's been a very entertaining discussion. And look forward to talking to you all next time. Thanks for listening.
Now, Chris, if you were to change our flag, presumably we will, even when we become a republic, what would you change it to?
I'd like to have our Bodie McBoatface moment and maybe a large echidna with laser eyes. I think the echidna's the missed animal. It's the forgotten animal. Everyone focuses on the kangaroo as a symbol of everything, or the platypus. Well, it's just the quiet achiever. It's out there in the bush doing its thing. It's hoovering up ants and whatever else. It's just doing its thing. Let's have an echidna maybe in the canton. Thank you. The echidna in the canton and a Southern Cross. What do you think about that?
I'm very strongly anti-echidna.
What about?
I don't like monotremes.
Yeah.
I like my mammals with placentas or with pouches. I don't like them laying eggs. It's wrong.
An affront to God. What about something with the wattle colours? So I know I don't want to get too into our sporting colours, but the green and gold is a very Australian colours. That's the whole point.
I don't know green and gold. No.
But the point is, I think whatever the new flag is, and we should absolutely move on to a new flag, it needs to have a strong signal to our traditional, our Indigenous heritage. I think that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah. The national flower, I'd like to change that from the golden wattle, which is ridiculous. I can't take that seriously as a flower, to the triffid.
The triffid. Is that Australian?
No, it's not Australian, but the triffid is not the national plant of any country, and it's never going to be. So it's time someone took action. And also, it's a plant that does not muck around.
Don't mess with the plant.
Yeah. So I think it's sending a strong message to anyone who would be thinking of invading Australia or crossing us in any way. Coat of arms, do away with the Ruan emu. Don't like them.
You don't like the Ruan emu? I don't mind that, actually. I think that's kind of cool.
The British understand that in the absence of proper animals, they have to come up with ones that are either not their own or are mythical. So the lion and the unicorn. Ludicrous. But at the same time, when you look at the British coat of arms, you feel a certain respect for it. You go,
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm thinking more the bunyip, mythical creature, and a crocodile, a saltwater croc.
I don't mind the croc. Yeah. I like the idea of the croc being on there.
Rearing up.
And a bunyip holding the coat of arms or something.
Well, they both hold because crocs.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. You know what? You've got me on that one.
Oh, good.
For sure.
I'm making progress.